Chapter 4. The pain woke Jerry up. It was amazing he could awaken at all. Amazing and horrible. An instinctive cry pierced his lips at the hateful pain of his disemboweled innards tugging parts of his torso he couldn't identify. Some muscle, some thing. Ah! He couldn't think about it. Jerry couldn't even bear to think about it. Oh, God. His eyes closed and his coppery mouth opened as he tried to breathe. Breathing, of course, only agitated him more. It made him think of his organs moving around on top of him instead of inside him. His organs exposed to air. God! God! Jerry tried to open his eyes to see where he was. Tried. Because they twitched naturally toward the slimy pile of viscera that had been dumped atop his wound. Part of an intestine looked like it had been squished flat. And was that dust? Oh, God! Were his organs dirty? He had to suppose he was lucky it was all still attached. Yes, somehow, some way, his organs were still attached to him. If he could just keep, what was that? His spleen? Oh, he shouldn't try to guess. His organs kind of close to the wound and figure out a way to call for help. The paramedics or some genius surgeon would be able to tuck it all back. Bloody bile and whatever was left of his morning donuts raced up his esophagus and burst out of his mouth. Jerry sobbed to spit up on himself like an overgrown baby and groaned in agony at the subsequent pain. How had all this happened? Jerry was so focused on the pain and the horror of his current condition that he couldn't even remember how he had gotten this way. He shut his eyes and thought about his wife doing her weird Eastern breathing exercise whenever her aerobics got strenuous. He had no idea what she was doing. It involved a lot of huffing and puffing, sort of like childbirth, so it was probably some sort of woman thing, but he had a feeling that trying to control his breathing was a good idea. He hissed air out through his gnashing teeth, then slowly blew it through his rounded lips like he was blowing through a straw. The breaths he allowed back in were only the smallest and most necessary ones. He could afford to move his chest and torso only so much, and filling his lungs to any useful extent made him feel like the wound was tearing open and more was falling out. Soon he was trembling a little, but at the very least he was no longer groaning and kicking and thrashing about on the hard surface of wherever he was. Where was he? Where was he? Oh, no. The murder house. Jerry had come to open the murder house. He had come to open the murder house for that fat, greedy producer, and he had gone to the basement and come back up, and he had written a note, and then tears rolled down Jerry's cheeks, squeezing past eyes that remained scrunched shut because he couldn't stand to even accidentally look at his organs. Even thinking about them was too much. The wet, red-gray-pink viscera recalled the towering rabbit being splattered in his blood. The Easter Ripper. This was impossible. The Easter Ripper had been executed the year before. Was this some sort of bad dream? A psychotic break? Yeah, maybe that was it. Maybe this was a delusion. A fantasy. Jerry wasn't as hip to psychiatrist stuff as the missus was, but he was smart enough to know something that was too insane to be real. And this? Him in this cold place, organs hanging out, arms wet with blood, throat and mouth burning with tangy bile. Disemboweled, maybe even killed by the Easter Ripper? That just couldn't happen. That couldn't be real. Jerry couldn't be murdered. Murdering was for other people. Jerry was a real estate man. He wasn't a soldier or a criminal. He was a guy in his 40s who still nursed dreams of running his own agency and getting a chance to manage other salesmen for once. He had so much to live for. He had so much to do. And his kids. What about his kids? Jerry couldn't die. Not here. He realized now that death could always get him at any time, and that there was nothing he could do to stop it from swooping in. It had always been there, waiting. But today couldn't be that day. It couldn't. This was all some wild dream influenced by his call with Gary. Jerry would wake up soon. Any minute. And you know what he'd do? He'd kiss his wife's sleeping head and say, "Sorry I haven't been home enough lately, baby." And then he would pick up the bedside phone. He would dial Gary's number, and he'd say, "Take your $50 and choke on him, you slimy tracksuit-wearing imitation Dumbo. The deal's off." Jerry nodded against whatever surface he'd been laid upon in this dream world of his. His eyes still closed to avoid seeing the hateful contents of the nightmare into which he'd stumbled. Jerry tried to discern where he lay without having to look. Someplace cold and hard? Linoleum? No, not quite. A door opened somewhere, all parts of the dream. This couldn't be a linoleum floor. It was curved somehow. His neck hurt, propped forward by whatever he was laying on. Through the fever of his pain, his dreaming mind sought the answer. Someone lay a hand upon his head. His wife? Waking him up? I know, Jerry cried, his eyes flying open. A bathtub! The rusted sickle snagged the flesh of his throat and tore in, the cruel curve of the blade slitting a bright red valley across his windpipe. Jerry's eyes and tongue bugged from his head as a great fan of blood spritzed across the cold face of his killer. Their eyes met for what seemed to be an eternity, until the blood reduced from a violent pump to a lazy drizzle that echoed the laconic pull of death upon Jerry's mind. The killer turned away for a few seconds, then turned back to Jerry with something in his grip. He opened one of Jerry's limp, red hands. Through careful manipulation, this fiend slid a cold object into Jerry's palm, closed the dying man's fingers around it, and lowered the attached arm to let it rest upon his bloody chest. The realtor struggled to watch through the haze of blurring eyes as the killer patted his cheek and departed, but his long vision was failing. Unable to see anything but what was closest to him, a common effect in dreams, at least in Jerry's, Jerry looked down at himself at last. At least he couldn't see the organs anymore. They didn't even bother him. Not only had they become the least of his problems, they didn't even hurt anymore. Was this shock? Death? Was there a difference? Jerry lifted the smooth, strangely shaped object in his hand. What was it? Not quite round, delicate, but hard, almost like an Easter egg.